All right, so this is our incomplete game, and here we're going to go ahead and start to set up our shadows using Fast Shadow Projector. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the Unity shadows that are on the Viking, and then we're going to go ahead and add a shadow projector and a shadow receiver to the objects that want to project or receive shadows. So the way that this system works and the way that it stays efficient is that objects that we want to project shadows need to have a shadow projector component, and then the surfaces, the meshes that we need to have receive shadows, we then put a shadow receiver component on it so that we don't calculate any any shadows on objects that we don't want or don't need to have any shadows that are received onto that surface. So what I'm going to first do is I'm going to select my little Viking character, and if we frame selected on him and take a look at him, we can see that he's got shadows. They're being projected by Unity, so we want to turn those off. So I'm going to select the Viking, find the Viking game object inside with a model with a skinned mesh renderer, and then I'm going to take cast shadows and I'm going to turn shadows off. And then once shadows are off, I'm going to come back to the Viking. So the first thing I want to do is actually set the shadow receivers onto the game objects that will go ahead and receive shadows. So sort of backing out and looking at the level, I want to put them on sort of the island, and I'm using the control key on Windows. You can use the command key on Mac, and I'm selecting the various places that the character could walk and project shadows. So that's going to be the surfaces, also these little medallions, these little rock pieces, and I think if we look at it, he's not going to be able to get down onto the surface. Well, just in case he can jump down, we'll grab that. But I think the nav mesh is not going to let him. So we have all these surfaces, and so let's go ahead and add a component. So let's type in the word shadow, and we can see that there's a shadow projector and a shadow receiver. So what we want to do is add the shadow receiver onto all of these objects. Now it says multi-object editing not supported, but if we look at a single object, we can see that that shadow receiver doesn't have any public properties that we can set. It just simply marks this object as a surface that can receive shadows. We just want to make sure that everywhere that the character can walk, that we see the shadows, that we make sure that there is this shadow receiver on it. Okay, and so then we're going to come back to our Viking, frame selected on this guy by hitting the F key while our cursor is over the scene view. And here we want to add a component, and we want to add the shadow projector. And so we're now telling the system that we're now projecting shadows from our Viking. Now if we notice, we don't see a shadow. We don't see a shadow inside the scene. And that's because this shadow system does not work at edit time. We can only see this at runtime. So we need to set up a couple more things before we can actually see this, even if we were at runtime. The first thing is that we have no shadow material here. So let's go ahead and use the circle select button. And I'm just going to go and add a simple blob shadow to this. So let's just add the blob shadow. This could be a different material. We could actually be trying to project more of the actual shape, but for simplicity of this demonstration, and also to show that you can do this for extra performance. So if you have, a performance constrained device, you're targeting certain mobile devices, you might want to make this more, make this a simpler type of shadow. And sometimes our games are not all about shadows. We just simply want to ground the character inside the scene. And a blob shadow, it's a very traditional way of putting simple shadows in the scene. So we're just going to simply use a blob shadow for this. But there are other shadows that shadow types that the shadow projector can go ahead and create. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and we're going to then enter play mode. And we can see that underneath our Viking that there is now a little blob shadow. There's a couple of things about it that I don't like. In my opinion, I think it's too small. Now, this is just opinion, because Matt thinks it's too big, and he likes a little delicate sort of comic shadow to go underneath the Viking. But since I'm presenting, sorry Matt, I'm going to make it bigger. The other thing I think about it is that it's a bit too dark, is that if we come over to the existing shadows that are being that are baked or projected, we can see that they're a lot more gray, and our character shadow is very, very dark. So let's go ahead and adjust that in the shadow projector. So The first thing I do is shadow size. I'll just make that a little bit larger, 1.25, and I want to take the shadow opacity down to about 0.75, so a little bit lighter in color. I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to enter play mode to test. And we can see that that shadow is slightly bigger and slightly more gray. I mean, for your game, you might want to fine tune it a little bit more. Maybe it's a little bit too dark still, hard to say. But for me, that looks better. And so you can adjust the size, you can adjust the opacity. There's a whole bunch more settings. We're just using some of the most basic settings because we've got so many things to cover today. This is going to be a long session anyway. So now we need to add our shadows to the shields. If you can see that those shields are there's a light, which is actually just a particle system that is projecting down onto our shields to bring attention to them, but they don't have any shadow. So let's go ahead and add a shadow to them as well. So I'm going to leave play mode, and I'm going to copy this shadow projector component. So copy component. And then I'm going to come down to my project, and under Viking content, under prefabs, I'm going to find the Viking shield. So this is just the prefab of the Viking shield because each one of these collectibles is a prefab. Then using the gear icon, I'm going to paste the component as new. And so we simply get that that shadow projector now on our prefab. What I want to do is go ahead and reduce that shadow size back down to 1 because I think it's going to be too big. And we want to sort of make it look different from our hero character. So let's go ahead and save this, and then we're going to enter play mode to test. And we can see that now our shields have their little shadows as well. So now when we're looking around the scene, we can see that there are shadows. Our little guy here is got shadows, and it's dynamic at this point, but also you can choose to bake these shadows into the geometry so that you can save performance. So you don't necessarily have to put a shadow projector on absolutely every object. You want to experiment with your project when you've got this package, and you want to profile, because the only way that you're going to really find out where your savings are and how you're spending your performance budget is by profiling your game. So start off with some of the key parts. Maybe it's the dynamic shields and the character, and we find that those need blob shadows, but you can go ahead and put shadow projectors onto the trees and it works fine. You may find that for your particular game and your target audience that you need to bake those shadows into the game. Oh dear, took too long. We've lost the game. So yes, this game actually has a timer in it. And if we spend too long and we don't collect the shields and don't exit the level, then we lose. And that was a little bit of the you lose box, but we don't have the camera set up for that. We're going ahead and reusing this project as a demonstration for today. So that's Fast Shadow Projector. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at chat, and then we'll move on to Fingers, which is touch gestures for mobile by Digital Ruby.